Hey guys, we are back up in the power rankings for Hell's Kitchen Head Chefs Only following episode 8. And this was a very interesting episode for these rankings here, where we obviously have quite a bit to talk about and some changes to be made, but we'll get to that soon enough. But we have 11 people to talk about, and it's wasting more time. Let's get into the video. So starting off at number 11, we have the latest boo from the season, and here we have Anthony. And this was probably the biggest shock to the power rankings up to this point, where obviously last week was another pretty big shock with Megan going home, someone who I had previously pretty high. And yet here we are with another even bigger shock, if I'm being honest, considering that Anthony was someone I was very high on for a lot of the season. I felt like they were getting a mostly solid edit, where even though people were talking about how he was a bit too quiet at certain points, I feel like he was getting pretty solid content where he was getting all this personal content, all this content about him being a competent chef and a strong leader, all while not being overexposed either. And it felt like it was set up for Anthony to be this really dangerous player down the road, only for him to be sniped out of the game in the Cook for Your Life challenge. And I will say that I was getting strange vibes while watching this episode, where first up you have him getting all this content early on about him being a cancer survivor, which felt a bit too much in my opinion, where I felt like he had gotten just enough personal content earlier in the season talking about his grandma, but for this episode to add on other stuff like being a cancer survivor and even later on talking about working at a senior living facility, it just felt like they were just being a bit too on the nose here. And I felt like even if he had survived this episode, I probably would have been lower on Anthony's chances here. But instead, it was all set up for him being taken out in the Cook for Your Life challenge, where he ends up making a pretty fatal mistake by leaving a bone in his dish. And while I think Anthony was the stronger chef across the entire season, I think Ramsay did make the correct decision here, as considering that the other dishes weren't even that bad, it would have come off as a bit egregious for Ramsay to eliminate someone else when Anthony made that big of a mistake. So I don't think the outcome here was that far out of left field by the end of it. But if you are talking about Anthony more generally, I do think he is one of the better pre-Black Jacket boots here, considering he was a pretty strong chef for a lot of the season based off his in-game performance. And we see that with Ramsay allowing him to keep his jacket on his way out. So again, I feel like Anthony's a pretty strong chef, definitely a good leader, just made a pretty bad mistake that resulted in his elimination here. But obviously he's now out of the game to where he's here at number 11. And with that, we have 10 people left in the game to talk about. And as usual, I'll be ranking them based on how likely they think they are to win the game based on their edit and current game position. And while there are plenty of changes to talk about towards the top of the list, I feel like the bottom of the list remains pretty solidified for me. By number 10, we do have Amanda. And this was another not great episode for Amanda here, where she once again does pretty poorly in the challenge. And I feel like her edit has been pretty similar across these last few episodes, where it's a mixture of her making mistakes, but also propping up Ramsay by talking about how he's so good and that nothing she does can get past him. And I feel like this episode didn't really change my view on Amanda, where even though she does end up surviving the Cook for Your Life challenge, I feel like we are seeing her like making tons of mistakes, and also just her not really living up to the challenge, where considering the amount that she's talking about Ramsay being so amazing while she is clearly making all these mistakes, makes me feel like it's just a matter of time before she goes home. I feel like this episode didn't really change that view. So for those reasons, she's still at the bottom at number 10. Now moving on to number 9, and we have another person who is remaining around the same spot as last week, and that person is Amar. And again, Amar is kind of similar to Amanda, where she's kind of just treading water in the game right now, does pretty poorly in the challenge, but does fine enough in the Cook for Your Life challenge to where she ends up surviving. Though I think the key difference between Amanda and Amar is that I feel like Amanda has been getting more focus on her mistakes and is being shown more to be out of her depths, considering how much she props up Ramsay, whereas I feel like Amar is not getting as much focus on her mistakes, and it's just kind of treading water in the game. And while I don't think Amar is winning at this point, I feel like this is probably a better episode for her compared to last week. Though I feel like compared to everyone else, I feel like it's not really enough to move her up. So for those reasons, I still have her here at number 9. Now moving on to number 8, and this person has actually gone down compared to last week, as I feel less and less confident about their chances to actually win the game. But number 8, we do have Lulu, and this was another pretty rocky episode for Lulu from a performance standpoint, where we once again see her doing pretty poorly in the challenge, where she talks about taking this risk by making this yoki, and talks about how she's taking this risk because she hasn't done the best in challenges, only for it to completely backfire, does poorly in the challenge, to where she has to cook for her life. And while she does survive that, I feel like the fact that we are continuing to see Lulu making more and more mistakes and the show not really hiding that is probably not the greatest sign for me, and it wouldn't shock me if Lulu is a boot in the next couple rounds. In fact, there was plenty of speculation that she was going to be the boot in this episode, considering that we had gotten this set up to her making more and more mistakes. But even though that she's still in the game, I'm just not feeling that great about her at this point, considering how rocky her performance has been, and I wouldn't be shocked if she's gone before the Black Jackets, so because of that, she is here at number 8. Now moving on to number 7, and this person has actually moved up a spot compared to last week, and that person is Brittany. And admittedly, a lot of this comes down to her performance in this episode, where she does pretty well in the challenge, is given safety from the Cook for Your Life challenge, which is all pretty good. Not to mention that I still think there is some upside with her potentially being this underdog figure down the road, where I think there's definitely some indication that she could have some longevity within her, but I feel like at the end of the day, I feel like I'm just so much higher on other people based off their in-game performance, based off the content that they've gotten on the show, where I feel like while Brittany could be this underdog, I feel like it'll be hard for me to see how she gets towards the very, very end. So for those reasons, I still can't really have her as a top contender. So because of that, I do have her here at number 7. Now moving on to number 6, and this person has also moved up a spot solely by Lulu moving down, but at number 6, we do have Brandon. And this was another pretty interesting episode for Brandon here, where we once again see him kind of having an up and down performance where he does pretty mediocrely in the challenge that results in him being in the Cook for Your Life challenge, and we then see him doing pretty well in that, being the first to be given safety there. So again, I feel like there's some pretty good stuff for Brandon this episode. The reason why I don't have him higher is something that I already talked about in other videos, is that I feel like the show doesn't really show Brandon being that big of a leader at the end of the day, where it feels like he's not really elevating his team as much as certain other people. And while he could be like this big threat for down the road and this rival for Egypt, I feel like considering that we haven't really gotten much focus on Brandon being a leader figure, but more so just being this competent chef, makes it hard for me to see how he ends up going on to win the game. Though if he ends up having more leadership content in the future, I could see him becoming this bigger figure. But as things stand right now, I feel like this episode didn't really change my view of Brandon too much. So it's for those reasons that he's still here at number 6. Now moving on to number 5, and this is where I think most of the changes in this video will come. Where obviously Anthony was someone I was very high on for the entire season. He was literally number 1 in every single episode up until his eventual boot. And now that Anthony's out of the game, it is forcing me to reconsider my picks here and is forcing me to really reanalyze certain people. And I think number 5 is a clear example of this. But number 5, we actually have Kyle. And this is actually a downward trend for Kyle here, where I had previously had Kyle at number 2 for the last couple weeks. But I think the more that I think about it, I think Kyle has a similar issue to Brandon, where I feel like we haven't really seen Kyle being that big of a leader figure across the season, which I think is a pretty big issue there. Where I feel like before, I feel like the fact that we gotten Kyle getting tons of focus for his mistakes in the challenge a couple episodes ago was all pretty good. But I feel like this episode was kind of a dodo episode for him, where we see him using Beauty and the Beast as a clue, even though that's 4 words in the challenge. And even then thinking that Jasmine was from Beauty and the Beast when she was from Aladdin. You also have him getting on his team's nerves during the punishment, where it seems like he's not taking things as seriously. And I think now seeing that other people are kind of emerging as these leader figures, it is kind of making it harder for me to imagine Kyle going on to win the game and more so just being this big character. And that has caused me to drop on Kyle a bit. Now, there's a chance that this is just a one-off episode and things could turn around. But I think now just thinking about how Kyle's not really emerging as a leader the way that I would imagine him to, makes it harder for me to see how he goes on to win the game by the end of it, even though he could have some longevity. So it's for those reasons I did drop Kyle here to number 5. Now moving on to number 4, and this is someone who I definitely debated putting higher considering Anthony's now out of the game, but I'm still a bit hesitant to do so. But at number 4, we do have Egypt. And I think now that Anthony's out of the game, I think Egypt probably stands the most to benefit from that, considering that they had previously been shown working together, considering that Egypt was shown to be the other pretty big leader within the blue team. And I feel like now that Anthony's gone, I think that definitely opens things up for Egypt to become this bigger character on the season, sort of becoming what I thought Anthony would be. However, I think the big issue with Egypt is I just feel like he's gotten a bit too overexposed. I feel like considering his early episodes of his struggles, and even now, he got a pretty big episode this week with his dish not being chosen for the challenge, only for that to be a mistake. I do wonder if this is too much content for Egypt, and while he could definitely be in the game for a while and definitely be a big figure in the season, I do wonder if him getting this much content this early could lead to his downfall down the road. But at the end of the day, I still think Egypt is in pretty good shape, where he was once again being shown being a pretty competent chef on the team. And while you can definitely qualm with the fact that his team didn't believe in him enough to pick his dish for the challenge, I think he definitely stands to be a pretty major character on the season at this point, and probably one of the people I feel better about on the blue team. But I feel like at this point, considering where things stand, I feel like I kind of had to leave him here at number 4, even though he definitely has room to move up. But for now, he's here number 4. Now moving on to number 3, and this person has actually gone up compared to last week. I feel like Anthony leaving the game definitely opens things up for this person to do well, and that person is Hannah. And admittedly, I've been a bit lower on Hannah compared to other people. I've been hearing people online talk about how Hannah is seen as his front runner, and while I have disagreed with that for a lot of the season, I think she definitely has some legs to stand on. And I think now that Anthony's out of the game and the field's a bit more opened up, I think that definitely leaves room for Hannah to become like this big figure on the red team moving forward. Or while this episode was not the flashiest in the world for Hannah, where she does well in the challenge and is safe from the Cook for Your Life challenge, I think there's definitely not room for Hannah to become like this big figure later on. And I think compared to other people on the red team, I feel like she hasn't really made as many mistakes compared to those other people. Now, realistically, I am still a bit up in the air over whether she'll actually win by the end of it. Though I think now that we're getting deeper into the competition, I think there's definitely room for Hannah to grow as a chef and for her to become more prominent on the show. So I feel like for those reasons, I have moved higher on her, especially with other people like Kyle not being shown as being strong as a leader, and people like Egypt just being a bit too overexposed. I think that leaves an opening for Hannah to become this bigger figure on the season, which is why I have moved her up here to number 3. Now moving on to number 2, and we essentially have the same thing, but this time this person being on the blue team, and here we have Joe. And I think of the people who have not gotten the biggest edits in the world, I think Joe probably has a bit more potential to become a more prominent chef, especially now that Anthony's out of the game. I think there's definitely now an opportunity for Joe to really emerge as his leader on the blue team. Now, realistically, this is another kind of alright episode for him where, again, does well in the challenge. He ends up being safe from the elimination. And he also talked about Kyle like being this nuisance during the punishment, which could set him up to be like this more serious chef and someone who could definitely step up into a leadership role now that Anthony's gone. No, if I'm being honest, I still think there's a world where Joe could move back down, particularly if Egypt does start to become the star of the show in the future. But I feel like considering that Egypt has already had this up and down trajectory across the season, I feel like there's definitely some doubt there as well. That makes me not want to put Egypt above Joe at this point, but I feel like Joe is definitely the Hannah of his team, someone who definitely has the potential to pop off and sort of fill this void that Anthony left behind. And I feel like with Joe already having more personal content compared to Hannah, that makes me feel a bit more confident in Joe's chances compared to Hannah's, which is why I have Joe a bit higher at number 2. And now, at number 1, the person I believe is the most likely to win Hell's Kitchen head chefs only at this point is Wit. And this was to be expected here, considering that I had Wit at number 2 the last couple weeks, and now that Anthony's gone. I did naturally put her up to number 1. I feel like there wasn't really anything in this episode that made me want to put Wit lower, considering she had another pretty strong performance here with her doing pretty well in the challenge, is safe there. Also get some personal content, talking about her grandma, which is all pretty good. And you even have other people on her team, like Amar propping her up as well. I feel like this was a fine enough episode to where I can't really move her down. And I feel like considering the doubts that I have about other people, that kind of naturally puts her a bit higher. Now, I don't think Wit's out of the woods by any means, where I think for one, her content can still come off as a bit mean-spirited, or while her team hasn't really responded negatively to her leadership style, I could definitely see a world where she comes off as a bit too overbearing and too serious, so I think that's an issue. I think screen time's another issue where she's definitely a bit too prominent on the show and could come off as a bit too obvious of a winner, and I can definitely see some of these more under-the-radar people popping off later on this season that could make them overtake her. So again, I'm not saying that Wit is for sure going to win at this point. I still think there's plenty of room for other people to move up, especially now that Anthony's gone. But I feel like considering the episode that she got here, considering that I don't really have much proof that the likes of Hannah or Joe could overtake her, and even Egypt being someone I have question marks about, I feel like for now, having Wit number 1 is not too out of line, and considering what we have seen so far, I feel like I had to have Wit here at number 1. And there we go, that'll do it for this week's video. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe, really helps with the channel. Now I'll be back again next week to update the power rankings again, so you can look forward to that. I am covering Survivor 47 as well, so you can expect weekly power rankings of that show as well. I'm on Patreon and have a YouTube membership, so if you want to consider supporting the channel, you can do so by clicking the link in the description, and you can also join the Discord server by also clicking the link in the description. There's a lot of stuff coming your way, but for now, that is a video. See ya.